Good evening, Metabreakers. Welcome back to our stream. It's our series around tournament results once more. And this time, JP is the abuser, and I'm your host for the evening. So I'm Phil. I'm your host for the evening.
And I'm
And
JP.
welcome back. If you watched our show a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that I took a hideous, abusive Nighthawk list, and this weekend was JP's turn to go to Clash of Clans in Scotland, taking slaves for the weekend. So JP, what is Clash of Clans? What is Clash of Clans all about, and what were you up to for the weekend?
So Clash of Clans is a long-standing Scottish event to sort of, increase the popularity and get people playing teams. It's twice a year, once before Six Nations and once before the World Championships, and so it sort of gives the opportunity for the various Scottish players to one, get practice, and two, for people who aren't on the team to see what Teams Warhammer is like. And for anyone, we always say this, but for anyone watching now, if you do, if you haven't tried Team Warhammer, you definitely should. I think it's the most fun way to play, and also there's always spots at Clash if you want to go that far north for it. But it's run by Callum Sinclair, and he's a really good TO, and the event is always an absolute blast. So yeah, it was really fun.
How many teams, how many players were we looking at? What sort of size is that event then?
So I think it's 10 teams of 6 players each. So a little smaller than Worlds or Six Nations, which is 8 players. But yeah, six feels like a good size to get, a good number of teams, and also you still get to experience the pairings process and a variety of lists and stuff like that.
For those of our viewers who are not familiar with Teams events, then, so you talk about the pairings process there. So with Teams event, then, so you're turning up with 6 of your mates, 5 of your mates, teams of 6, 5 of your mates even, and how does that work then? So you'll get paired against another 6. You'll match against another team. So how does that then look like from a how does a teams event differ to a singles event then?
Yeah, so basically, largely speaking, the rules of teams are that you're not allowed to duplicate any factions. You can't go and bring 6 slaves lists or whatever, even if slaves is really good. So each person will have their own, faction and list, and basically you'll sort of discuss beforehand as a team. Although our captain will say we definitely didn't do enough work. Our captain DJ had to do most of the work on the pairings for this. But you'll say, I'll be like, I'm playing Archaon, right? And I'll say, I don't want to play versus very much shooting. I prefer missions that have a lower number of objectives, and stuff like that. And so then you'll have all that, and then there's a pairings process. Without going into too much of the detail, the captains will sort of go through this process of choosing who in our team is going to play who in their team. So both captains will be sitting there and they'll think, okay, well, I can get a good matchup here, but then maybe I'll have to sacrifice a good matchup later. And there is, sort of a miniature card game for deciding that. But yeah, so often the big difference between teams list and singles list is that your teams list can afford to maybe not be as much of an all-rounder, because you can say, well, if I can really avoid 1 or 2 counters, like I can almost be guaranteed to not play these counters, you can get away with being a little bit greedier with what your list is.
Okay, so you can lean into something that suits quite a bit, as long as your captain knows what he's doing, sort of thing. So. So with it being a warm up for Worlds or a warm up for Six Nations, then were you seeing? Obviously, we're looking at the meta in some of the discussion, etc. Before we get into your actual lists, we talked about the slaves list that went well at the GT a couple of weeks ago. But were you seeing a lot of similarity in the races the teams were taking across their 6 lists? Were there a lot of slaves? Was there a lot of other particular types of races that were showing quite a bit, or were there quite a broad spectrum of armies?
Yeah, it's always a mix. I mean, you see a lot of slaves. I feel like slaves is an army that is always really popular, even when it's not good. And right now it is good. So there was a lot of slaves around. You saw Varangard, you saw Be'lakor. There was a lot of Lumineth, a lot of Nighthaunt, a fair bit of Soulblight Gravelord. Soulblight Gravelords, but Graveguard lists. And so I think often at these team events you'll see like 3 or 4 lists that lots of teams bring, and then picking those last 2 lists, people can sort of vary. We had Tzeentch. There was a small amount of Tzeentch, even though they're very strong right now. There's some Khorne out there. There's some. I played against Nurgle. There were a lot of Trogs around. I played Trogs twice, but we didn't bring Trogs. So it tends to be, there's like a core of lists that you see on most teams, and then everybody sort of has their own ideas about what's best going to fill the team out with those last two lists.
Almost like, what can you spin up most from a wildcard slot to throw your opponents off? Maybe?
Exactly. Yeah.
Something like
Yeah.
that. So you were taking the favoured slaves for the weekend. So,
Yes.
So what did that look like? What did you look to take for the weekend?
So I'll pull my list up here. So slaves list with Archaon. As soon as you've got Archaon, sort of at 900 points, you obviously are somewhat limited in how much other stuff you can bring. So the list essentially is Archaon, 10 Chaos Chosen. Those are the two like heavy hitters of the list.
Right.
And then, a variety of other bits and bobs. So you have a little Chaos Sorcerer Lord who does a variety of good things, which I'll get into in a sec. And then you sort of have these 4 small units of the Furies, the 2 units of Dark Oath Fell Riders, who are like the Chaos Marauders, the Horsemen, and 6 Raptorics. And so I've just rebuilt this list in the post battle scroll points. So it's 2030 now, which means you'll have to figure out a way. Maybe you replace these Fell Riders with another unit of Furies, or as you suggested earlier, Phil, when we talked about it, you could maybe upgrade the Raptorics to Furies and take 3 units of Furies. You have to rejiggle those points a little bit, but the list would largely function the same, which is that you've got these 4 units of small, fast models that operate for scoring battle tactics and holding objectives that aren't particularly contested, and they die easily. And the Fell Riders are pretty good as chaff versus chaff. They get +1 damage on the charge, and once per game, they have a really long rule that once per game, if they charge a single unit and they're the only unit in combat with it, they can give themselves +1 rend for the rest of the battle, which is interesting. But it makes them good. When I had my 1 unit of Fell Riders fighting 1 unit of Plague Bearers or Clan Rats or something like that, you could sort of win that fight because they're quite good in that chaff role. The Furies, again, 12-inch move. And for people who don't know, at the start of combat, instead of, before anyone's fought, they roll a dice, and on a 3-up, they can just make a move and get out of combat. So, again, that can be good as a screen. That can be good. I used it to steal someone's Desecrate. Or it's not called that now. Take their lands. So someone picked Take Their Lands. They had, I had nothing on it. They had 3 guys on it. My Furies got into combat. I rolled a 3-up, and then I moved the Furies onto that piece of terrain. So they're nice for doing, and also, you can sort of leave them in combat to stop a counter charge. Stop the unit that they're in combat with counter charging, and then you roll the 3-up and they fly away. So they also don't die. Although the last time I tried to do that, I just failed the 3-up and they exploded. But sometimes it'll happen. The Raptorics, again, similar sort of thing. But what you do is you use the seasonal sort of the Honor Guard rules to make them a bodyguard for Archaon. And I just run them around with Archaon. And basically what that does is while they are wholly within 6 of Archaon, everything that is in combat with Archaon is -1 attack. So with his huge base, you can really tie up armies. He's already tanky with 25 wounds, 3-up save, 5-up ward, -1 to wound if you mark him as Nurgle, which I always did, because he chooses his mark at the start of the game. He's really, really tanky, and that just makes him even more tanky. And again, he's got a really big base, so it can be hard for people, if they are tagged, to even get to the Raptorics if they're at the back or something like that. And yeah, so the Sorcerer Lord, he has Radiance of Dark Glory, which is on a 3-up, he can heal a friendly unit for 1 wound, or if they're a monster, which Archaon is, heal him for 3. You've got to be within 12 for that, so it doesn't always come up, but if you keep him up, it's good. Infernal Puppet just does D3 more. It's good against Nagash, but not really important to the list. And then, the other big thing is the 10 Chaos Chosen. So I marked them as Nurgle. The list is probably better if you mark them as Khorne. So Khorne gives them +1 attack when they charge. So they go from 31 attacks to 41 attacks, and Chosen also once per game can fight twice, though the second fight is at the end of the phase, so you can sort of get 20 extra attacks out of that. I marked them as Nurgle because I hadn't had so much practice with the list that I found in the one practice game I played and multiple games of the thing that I would just get charged, and I liked that Nurgle worked whether you got charged or not. And in my head, what I'd tell myself is I'd say Nurgle was keeping, 1 extra Chosen alive versus Khorne in between those 2 activations. So that's also getting you some extra attacks. But I think, the better you are at using them and securing yourself those good charges, you could definitely get away with using Khorne. Archaon and the Chaos Sorcerer Lord are both wizards, and they can also, there's a 3d6 charge spell in Slaves, so the Chosen only move 5 inches, which is probably the weakest thing about them.
Yeah.
But so often you have the Chaos Sorcerer Lord with the Chosen. On a 3-up, he gives them a 5-up ward, and he can also give them that spell for 3d6 charge. I also had the Primal Energy endless spells in there, so Jaws and Burning Head, they can sort of do generic manifestation things, and then you also have the Life Swarm in there again to keep Archaon fighting a million things with debuff things and stay alive forever, which he lived through almost all of my games, which we will come to later. But yeah, so that is essentially the list, and I think really the sort of biggest thing, one of the biggest power points for the list for people who don't know about Archaon, he has this rule called the Eye of Sheerian, not the Eye of Ed Sheeran, as I feel like everyone has always called it. And so how that works is in your hero phase, you can roll a dice, and on a 1 to 3, your opponent goes first in the next battle round, and on a 4 to 6, you go first in the next battle round. So it's a little bit like priority, but you don't get to choose. So whoever sort of wins that roll doesn't get to choose. They have to go first. And because you don't choose, it also means if you're taking a double, you can still do a battle tactic. So that is, and it's a 2-drop list, which is not as low as it used to be, but I did, again, in a teams event, my captain can sort of say, I'm going to put you into lists that are higher drops than yours. And so you can give your opponent the first turn, and then you roll that, and if you roll the 4-up, you're getting the double, and that is just really strong because you can just sort of, fully run your Chosen up. You can charge Archaon into whatever you want, and then you can power through is also really good there. You can then power through Archaon, so he's back out of combat. He moves 14. He's ready to charge something else because you're going to be getting that next turn. So it really lets you just fully commit to the double. And I got the 4-up 3 out of my 5 games, so I got the better side of average, and it was just really, really strong. I think if you get that 4-up, you're really increasing your win rate probably for that game by 30, 40, 50%. So it's really strong. So yeah, that's basically the list. And I think I think if you're really good at the game, you can probably get a lot of mileage out of a variety of the small tweaks. But even if you're just picking up this list or an Archaon list for the first time, there's a lot of power in just being like, I roll that 4-up, and if I get it, I full send, and you're just going to be able to do too much damage for some armies to keep up with.
Which is, I guess, when you're putting 900 points into a model, what you want to see back out of it, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah, that does sound huge. So with you being 2-drops, then did it crop up as an issue about picking first at all, or were you able to be shielded from that negative matchup, like you said? Or
I was lower drops, I think, in 4 of my games, and in my first game it was even, and I won the roll off. So I always got to give away first, except in the last game where I took first, because it was Star Strike and I really wanted to dominate the single objective. But otherwise, I just stuck to that same sort of battle plan, which was to give away first and play for a double. And so in my first game, I was playing against Trogs, and I didn't. So he took his turn, and I'll actually bring up the picture of that game, the deployment from that game.
Yeah, saying that about obviously the plan, so it'd be interesting to know kind of did you go into every game with a plan of how you were going to deploy, or did you? We talked to a lot of people, don't we?
Yeah.
I'll what my opponent's doing, or did you actually go in with every game thinking, right, I've got a plan and kind of doesn't really matter what they do that affect me? Or
sure, yeah. Okay, let's before we get into that specific Trogs game, we'll bring up this. Oh wait, no, is our MS Paint stream? There it is. Nice. So one of the things about the list that I found in practice was that because the Chosen are slow and Archaon's base is really big, you could run. One of the problems I would run into is just getting in my own way. So like in one of my games at the weekend, I actually, I was doing that thing where I charged in, I knew I was getting the double, and I went to power through, and it was just not actually physically possible for me to land anywhere. It looked like there was a lot of room, but it was like there's a little bit of terrain here. There's, a single model that would block off 3 inches here. And so, nothing, it wasn't something that my opponent had particularly blocked off or that I had, thought about leaving open, but it was just his base was so big. So basically every single time I deployed, if we sort of imagine that, that this is my deployment and, here's my, the enemies over here. And let's say there's, 3 objectives. I would basically deploy exactly the same way every time. And so the first thing I would do is I would put the Chosen basically just front and center in a line. I'll put C there for Chosen. And the reason for that is because they move 5. I just was like, I want them to have the best chance. And again, because often I was deploying first because I was... I want to have the lower drops and get the choice of who goes first. So I want the Chosen to just have the best chance of getting to wherever it is they need to go. So even if I know my opponent's going to, do something, they're a tanky unit, and tanky and slow means I just want to make sure I'm getting them into something. I want them to be fighting. Even if it's not even a great fight for them, that's sort of better than them, being stuck on the flank somewhere. So the Chosen would basically always go in the middle. Depending on exactly what the battle plan is or what my opponent's playing, I would either put the unit of Furies in front of them or behind them. So if there is a turn 1 threat for the Chosen, I'll put the Furies just in front of them to screen that a little bit out. And again, the Furies can leave, and then the Chosen can sort of pile into whatever is attacking them. Again, there's not a super lot that the Chosen are afraid of, but a little bit of a screen doesn't hurt. If that's sort of not... a threat, I'll actually move them the extra inch forward, just right on the line, and I'll have the Furies right behind them so that I can use those like as a retroactive screen, because the Furies are moving 12 inches, you can run them, and so they can, if I need to screen afterwards, they can leapfrog the Chosen. So once I've put those there, I then will basically put Archaon just right next to the Chosen, and he moves 14, so he doesn't really have that problem. And again, I want him central so that I can react to how my opponent deploys or where they go. But he can afford to be the one who's off to the side because he can sort of make up for that by being able to get to wherever he wants to go, or, often straight into your opponent to tag stuff up. As we talked about, tie him up with all those debuffs. So both of those as central as possible. The Raptorics, I would generally put base to base with Archaon wherever he was. Again, you want that bodyguard rule. And one thing I learned again from my practice games is I really wanted to keep the Raptorics tight in next to Archaon, so that basically you want them wholly within 3 of Archaon when you can, so that it's not possible for someone to fight the Raptors, get rid of the bodyguard rule without also engaging Archaon. Because one, engaging Archaon, if they're in Archaon's combat range, they lose the 1 attack, which is good, but also it means they would have to commit to something getting whacked by Archaon if they were in exchange for the Raptorics. So that was definitely a learning point for me in the game. And then with the sort of the Fell Riders, you can sometimes put them on the flank if you think you're going to go for. Is it called seize the flanks? That's what the
take the flank.
Take the flanks. Okay, seize the center. Yes, take the flanks. So you can have the Fell Riders on the sides for that. But also, as I said, they're not bad for clearing chaff and stuff like that. So sometimes I would just have them a bit more in the middle, just ready to support and fight some stuff, or tow onto one of these side objectives, something like that. And I just hope that you could grab seize the flanks in turn 5 with Archaon can just walk to 1. Again, his base is huge and his movement's high, and then you hope you have one other unit that is around near the side of the board, and you hope you remember to leave them there. But yeah, so generally speaking, that was how I deployed every game. And, part of that is that I was facing, relatively speaking, I was somewhat protected from the matchup, so we will talk a little bit. I did play against shooting Skaven on 8 objectives, which was a little bit sweaty. But I have this picture here of how I deployed in my first game against Trogs. And so he sort of had these 6 units of Trogs. We're playing focal points. So it's sort of 3 objectives in the middle as well as your home ones. But so he had had 1 unit of Trogs basically just threaten each objective, and then he used those to protect his squigs, who were sort of a bit more damage. And here, this was the game where I lost the 4-up so I knew he was going second. And Luke, our boy Metabreakers Luke, he sort of said, if you lose the prio, you can make sure you play defensive. I didn't not do that. Because I sort of felt, I was like, I don't know how, he scored a 10-point turn. I didn't really want to score a 1-point turn, or I guess a 4-point turn, if I could do a battle tactic. So I just saw, this was also a map where you see, like, there's this little pedestal bit of scenery that really stopped. I think actually I made probably quite a few mistakes in this game. I really wanted to tie up 2 units of Trogs with Archaon and then charge another one with the Chosen. But that little piece of terrain meant I sort of only meant tagging 1 unit of Trogs, and then the Chosen went into the other. And then when my opponent knew he was getting the turn, so he left space for his Squigs. The Squigs came in, they killed 7 of the Chosen. And then, sort of it was up in the air after that. And then luckily I won the next priority, and that sort of swung combat back in my favor. But it was quite a bloody game. But I think, the mistakes in that game, I think that aside from the mistakes in that game, I should say, I think the deployment was good. And again, this is quite a green matchup. Trogs, the Squigs are quite dangerous, but Trogs, they have 2 attacks base, and there's not a Trog boss or Trog in this list. So taking them from 2 attacks to 1 attacks with the bodyguard rule is really strong. Is really strong. So the long and the short of that is I deployed the same way every game, and then after that you're sort of operating on the plan of tank Archaon long enough that he doesn't die, and really it's sort of the Chosen are then free to maneuver. Even though they're slow because stuff's tied up, you use the Chosen as your main hammer to really clean up a lot of the stuff you really need to kill.
Yeah, so Archaon pins it in place like the anvil.
Yes, exactly.
Run around smashing it through with everything else, just actually scoring your points, yeah?
Yep.
Pretty much.
Yep. Exactly. And then, as I said, you've got, you're doing a battle tactic with these 5 horses, or, the Furies are running onto an objective or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously Archaon sheds a lot of points, doesn't it? I think we talked about in the list building a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? Saying that kind of balance of, sort of 14 to 1600 points of hammers and 3 to 500 points of scoring or chaff, and kind of, although there's less units in this list than you would see in most normal lists, actually it pretty much adheres to that kind of those ratios, doesn't it? Really,
yeah.
The Chosen, and it's a ratio that seems to work quite well, to be fair, depending how you balance it off. So you played Trogs, beat Trogs.
Mm-hmm.
So Shooty Steven gave you a heartbeat or 2, did it?
Yeah. So
objectives not.
Yeah, so it was 8 objectives, right? So if if you're operating on a sort of 2-unit policy, you don't really want to be playing those 8 objectives. And then the Skaven list was lots of clan rats, a vermin lord, a unit of 6 Jezzails, and a unit of 6 storm fiends. And so in that game, I did get the 4-up for the double turn, and I think really that is what won me the game. And so that allowed me to go in, fight the clan rats. Archaon didn't quite kill them all, power through, and then charge into the Jezzails at the back because I killed enough of the screens that there was space for me. And the Chosen killed over that double, killed all the Storm Fiends. And so basically at that point, you're pretty sure you're going to win, because the threats are gone. But, I had a good opponent, and it's a good mission for the Skaven and not so much for me. And so what he was doing then, and he was sort of pressing the weakness of the list, was he was basically saying, all right, well, I'm going to keep regenerating, half a unit of Jezzails or half a unit of Storm Fiends, come out of Gnawholes, teleport to these different objectives. And so I think the final score was like 48 to 40 or something like that, which is for teams which are scored from 0 to 20 points. That was like a 12-8 or something like that, about as close to a draw as you can get without actually drawing. And the reason for it was, again, like Archaon wasn't going to die, the Chosen weren't going to die, but they could only be in 2 places at once. And there's 8 of these objectives, and he's casting Skitter Leap, and he's, as I said, regenerating models and going through the Gnawhole. So it was it was, you know, a well played game by my opponent, because again, when you get that big double that you know about, he's obviously really up against it. I think the the Jezzails did 17 wounds to Archaon in the you know, with covering fire in my second turn. So if I'd lost the roll off for priority, and he had been able to, you know, if I knew I wasn't going to get the double, I would have had to definitely think about a different strategy, because I wouldn't have been able to soak 2 turns of Archaon just getting shot. Or maybe I would have had to. I don't know. I would have had to do something differently anyway. So that game, you know, I think, again, often with these top tier lists, it's like they're good all the time, and also they have some little get out of jail free cards for those bad matchups where it's like you can really just, you know, something can happen that you're like, oh, cool, I won anyways. You know, the list is strong enough to get lucky and win, where maybe some other lists are only good enough to win when you play really well and you have like also the benefit of some luck. Although there was definitely some luck here as well. But yeah, that 4-up was really strong.
It's interesting, we touched on before, the different modes of play as well, because I imagine your opponent against other people was looking and kind of going, right, my Jezzails and my Stormfiends, my Hammers, I'm going to clear units off, and my Clan Rat's going to tie them down, and must have probably quite early on realised he couldn't actually do that against you. So kind of, from what you were saying there, dropped into a very different style of play, and that kind of adaptive way of playing, going, right, well, actually, I'm the underdog, so, not so to speak, but you know, I can't dominate you, and therefore what I'm going to do is literally fall back on my sneaky tricks and try and hold in the game all the way through, which is very probably different than he played in his other games, I would imagine.
So, absolutely.
Which is an interesting one, because to I guess we'll come on to we'll come on to list weaknesses in a minute, I guess. So that was game 2. Skaven, what about game 3?
So game 3 was against Khorne, and that was on the Vice. And so the Vice is quite a good mission for me, again, because it sort of boils down to that one objective in the middle, and I've got enough units and my little fast units that can hold this stuff at the beginning. And against Khorne, who don't have, you know, teleporting or anything like that, it was basically fine for me. So the beginning is quite standoffish, you know, because you're getting your back objectives, and then I won the Eye of Ed Sheeran prior roll as well. I wasn't being able to particularly super leverage it, but it just still gives you nice tempo going through. And so I think it was a 13-7, relatively low scoring, but I managed to steal one of his objectives before it came the Vice. And then basically once we were all fighting in the middle, it mainly came down to the fact that Archaon and the Chosen were just able to win the fight. You know, again, if you're 2 combat armies and you've got, you know, Archaon has the threat range to engage first, so that took care of 20 of his bloodletters, and then also you get that second priority and you get to do more damage again. And then again, once that much damage was done, my opponent sort of realized that he was going to be mainly playing for points, and so he was using his Bloodthirster to escape and tying Archaon up. Archaon was stuck in combat with a Realm Gore Ritualist, but one of Archaon's rampages that he can do is he can roll a dice, and if he exceeds the wound characteristics of the target, he just eats them and heals for their wounds. And I was like, I could try and do 1 mortal wound on a 3 to you, but that seems pointless, so I'll just try to eat you, you know. But he was like, oh, how does that? I was like, it probably doesn't do anything. It only works on a 6. And then I just obviously rolled the 6 and ate the Realm Gore Ritualist and healed for 5 wounds. So that obviously didn't hurt either. But yeah, again, it was a close scoring game, where because of how strong Archaon was, and I had the life swarm up and stuff like that, I was like, I always sort of knew that I was winning, but my opponent again was able to give enough of a run around, make sure he secured his battle tactics and, you know, got his objectives when the Vice was far away, that it was relatively low scoring in the end. And then
I guess, like you say, you edged the you probably had more tanking in between the Nurgle and the and the Ward set. Like you said, the Vice is a strange one, isn't it? Because you can actually score quite high by just sitting off in those first 3 turns.
Exactly.
So it's quite hard to get quite a swing victory, isn't it? Unless you do go straight down their throat on turn 1 or 2. But like I said, that drags you away from the length later on, doesn't it? So
yes,
right.
Absolutely.
So That was a clean sweep on Saturday, so you obviously had a nice early night.
Well, I mean, we actually did. It was one of those things where everyone was like, "Oh yeah, our team was in first place. Everyone's sort of stoked." We were like, big night out, and then we got Indian food, had one beer, 9:30, back to the flat, ready for bed. But yeah, and then
and you did better than me and got up on time on Sunday.
Yes, I mean, as I know I told you this before, but our captain was sort of like, the game 4 doesn't start till 10. Mate sort of checked the pack and texted him and was like, it's actually at 9. He was like, I'm not coming in till 10. No, yeah, so that was all fine. And then game 4 in the morning was Trogs again. I forget what's the name of the mission. It's a lengthways mission, border war, I think. So there's 4 objectives, and your opponent's one is worth 5. Your home one is worth 1. Right. The side ones are worth 2. And honestly, when I won this is the third game where I won the roll off for the double turn, and it's a similar sort of game to the first Trog game, but this Trog list had the Trog boss and Trug, and so I tagged the Trogs. Didn't really take any damage on my first turn, but then he got the +1 attack buff from bonking Trug's thing on his head, and he also made the 3-up Trug buff from the Trog boss, so all his Trogs suddenly had 2 attacks. And then he got the Gobblepalooza buff to give them 1 rend. So Archaon basically exploded. Is the long and the short of it. Oh. And at this point, my captain came over and just looked at the board where everything for me was mostly dead. And he was just sort of, exactly. Yeah, so we've all seen it. You're like, why is there this circle of enemy units? So, and it was also, I made a reasonably nice play, I thought, where I put magical intervention to put fight last on the Trogs, which luckily I got off. It's a slave spell. And then I put all my attacks from Archaon into the Trogs to try and hit them before they hit me. But I just, for the luck I was getting, and I was, I think, overall lucky, but I just missed every single attack. So Archaon on it, he's got 6 attacks, 3 attacks, 4 attacks. My opponent didn't even have to roll a single save. They all went. And it was at that point I was like, okay, I think I'm in a little trouble. And then I think it was, then he's on really low wounds. I think he was on like 4 wounds. And so I put his last bound of attacks into Trug to try and put Trug into the sword and remove the +1 attack buff. I almost killed, I didn't Slayer of Kings him, unfortunately. But I got him to like 2 wounds remaining. And then I managed to do a sneaky little pile in with the Fell Riders. Got 1 attack through for 2 damage because they charged and killed Trug, which is probably what saved the game. And also, it was also at the same time the Chosen were running around. Like, I got a counter charge into some endless spells. Also, I don't know if anyone in the chat will know, but every time you kill a unit with in Slaves to Darkness, you get to roll on Eye of the Gods. And so my opponent had summoned some shackles, and in my turn I countercharged the shackles and killed them. And we sort of talked about it. We're like, they're an enemy unit in the combat phase, so I think you do get to roll an Eye of the Gods. So by the time it got to the end of the game, my Chosen had +2 rend, a 6-up ward, and +1 to hit. So they were like, there are only 4 of them left, but they were blenders. So again, also because Archaon was dead and my opponent played it quite well. It was a really bloody game. Everything was dead. My whole army was dead except for 3 Chosen. His whole army was dead except for three Trogs. We had 1 block of 6 Trogs that I just kept tying up with chaff, and 1 block of 3 Trogs that went around killing everything else. But yeah, managed to get the win on that one, another 13-7, I think. But yeah, the Chosen, especially when they got all those buffs from Eye of the Gods, were really doing a lot of work.
So if they survive those first couple of turns, they become like a unit of Chaos Lords.
Yes, exactly. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It was because the first turn I'm like, wow, Trogs are so tanky, and then because you're hitting them with 1 rend, and then by the end of it I was like, yeah, there's no saves. You get no saves anymore.
Not anymore. It's gone. The moon's gone.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was into game 5 then. A big game. What was game 5?
Yeah. So after a weekend of sort of definitely battling it out for some tight wins, I sort of had the stars align. No pun intended for Star Strike. So I was playing Star Strike, 2-drop versus 3-drop Nurgle with the Glockkin, Plague Bearers, some Blight Kings. and Nurgle all aren't in the best place overall right now. And on Star Strike, for people who don't know, in the first turn, one objective falls somewhere in the middle of the board, and it's the only objective on the table. So the only primary you score 3 points for holding one objective and 3 for scoring more, which again for turns 1 and 2 is just one objective. And because I knew I could go first, and I knew I had Archaon plus some chaff, I took first, and I just dominated that one objective, and it sort of knowing that would give me an early lead, that is very hard to come back from, basically. Because if my opponent, if I'm getting 2 scores of scoring 6 and my opponent's getting 2 scores of nothing for primary, it's hard to come back. And then it was just really, and everything goes right, where my opponent charged the Glockin into Archaon, and which I think was fine. I sort of envisioned that they'd be fighting each other for ages, that essentially we'd be fighting over that objective. They're both hard to kill, they both heal a little bit, so. But again, for people who don't know, Archaon has a rule for Slayer of Kings, which is if you roll 2, he has 4 attacks, 2s and 3s, and if you roll 2 6s to wound in the same roll, versus a hero or a monster, they are instantly slain. They just sort of get sucked into the sword or their soul. And I explained this to my opponent, and I was like, it's never happened. I was like, I've been playing Archaon since 2nd edition Age of Sigmar. It's never happened. I think it's like a 1 in 10. Like, I wouldn't really worry about it. And he charged the Glockin in on his turn 1. I rolled the dice, and just straight away, he just went into the sword. And, yes, exactly. It's one of those things. One of my previous opponents was sort of like, "Oh, how come I didn't hear you cheering?" I was like, it's a bit of an anticlimax for the game in general. I think it would have been different if it was like, "Oh, we're neck and neck. Am I gonna get it?" It was just sort of like, my opponent just sort of, he was very, very gentlemanly about it. We had a great fun game, but when that happened, he basically just shook my hand and was like, "Well played. Like, we'll play it out." And he's playing for points, but it's just going to be very, very difficult after if in your turn 1 you lose your 400 or 500 point unit for no exchange. Just sometimes you're going to get those swings. Back from that, isn't it? Yeah. So that was a big win for Archaon.
He doesn't have a lot of spare units, does he?
Yes, exactly. So it's the same as if, my Archaon got Hand of Dusted or something like that. You'd be like, well, I'm still going to play and try and get as many points as I can, but you're not really expecting to win the game if something like that happens.
So 5 from 5. You were dancing on air. How did your teammates get on? Were you dragging them up from the depths, or were they pulling you along?
I think for most of the rounds, I was scoring average. Again, I got, I was sort of keeping my own. We had a fun round 4, was our hardest round, and we won the round by 1 point versus our opponent's team. And luckily, because my game was the one that finished last, it sort of felt like I'd scored the winning goal, And also, that was the game versus the Trogs when Archaon got killed. And so my captain had been over a couple times, and he was like, "So have you lost?" Or he was like, "Is it a loss?" And I was like, "I don't actually know, because I never keep track of the score in my own games." I was just like, "It's very tight. So I don't know." And then I was like, "Okay, I won 13-7. And then he was like, "Yes, we won the round by 1 point." And although it was also amusing where in one of the games that the opponent team won, their captain had he picked Seize the Center as his battle tactic, forgotten about it, and charged off it. And he still won the game, but that he dropped 2 points for the round. And then so when our captain told him we'd won by 1 point, he just threw his head in his hands. I was like, that's the one that's going to haunt him forever. I know I've got a couple of those myself.
Those moments where you wish you'd never asked.
Yes, exactly.
Like, no, I'm better off not knowing.
Yes, exactly. Well, it was. I mentioned my artifact was not very good. So basically, the way it works is, once per game, the Sorcerer Lord can pick an enemy wizard within 24 inches, and every time they cast a spell, they take D3 mortal wounds. So, for most games, you're sort of going to be like, okay, I did D3 mortal wounds to a wizard, because your opponent probably doesn't need to cast 2 spells even if they can. But I did not remember at all that I had this artifact. Didn't think of it even once for the whole tournament. And there was a chance that I was going to end up playing versus Nagash. So if I had played versus Nagash, I would not have remembered to use it. And that's obviously, then you're talking about 8 times D3 mortal wounds, which is obviously really good. So if I'd played against Nagash and then I'd come out of the game being like, "Oh, I just lost," or whatever, and they'd be like, "Oh, how much damage did Infernal Puppet do?" I would have been like, Infernal what?"
What's that again?
So that was
Next
lucky
time you
for
need to
me.
take a little bit, sit it on the side of the
Yes,
table.
exactly.
I always used to do that with triumphs that I always used to forget about. I had a little painted battle tome that used to sit on the corner. And I'd be like, "Oh, what's that doing? Oh yeah, I've got a triumph. I remember
Yes,
now."
yes. No, yeah.
So you
That's
got a little prompt. So it
oh,
was a successful weekend.
yes.
Successful weekend piloting the list. Like you say, you had loads of test games going in. Was it one to get
It was
yourself
I
a
had two. I had two. I lost
two?
both.
Wow,
Um
excellent.
I think
So you're
I
going on a high.
yeah, I was going well, I mean, this best, losing all your practice games is definitely the way you learn. Again, like the thing with the Raptorics where I was playing against my good friend Craig, and he was like, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap, and I'm going to be just out of 3 of Archaon, and I'm going to target all the Raptorics, so we killed those. Um, and I also, had got to experience when I played versus Graveguard, and I sort of had I failed the 5-up ward on the Chosen, and I didn't screen them properly, and so they just got hit by 2. In my head I was sort of thinking, oh yeah, they're invincible. And most of the time they are if you're smart, but they are not invincible if you don't screen them or buff them at all. And so it was sort of, I think there's definitely some more things I could learn about the list, but I definitely did get some learning out of making some big dumb mistakes in my practice games.
Well, I think it's something we've said before, isn't it? In terms of number one, it's good to make your mistakes on the practice pitch, not on an event weekend. But number two, I think you said a couple of times, JP, where if you play some practice games with your actual list you're taking, you'll be putting yourself probably ahead of 50-60% of players there, which I know is probably a slightly different event like this where players know but even so, people will be taking new lists or different
Yeah,
lists
yeah,
or
yeah.
piloting lists at the time. And just even that marginal difference of, like you say, those few learnings in a practice game, even if you can just get 2 or 3 practice games with a list before you get to an event, it can make all the difference, right, on something that either leaves you sat in the bar going, oh, why didn't I think of that, versus actually, I already learned that in a practice game. My Raptorics are all gonna wrap and stay in range and that kind of thing. It makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yes.
Which I think,
100%. I definitely feel like you going from 0 practice games to 1 practice games is the biggest jump, really. Like, again, like the difference between sort of being like, okay, I understand how the list is supposed to work in theory and in your head, versus you're like, and again, like a big learning from my practice games was like, right, it's not that easy to move the 5-inch move block of Chosen and
yeah,
the 6.5-inch base of Archaon to right where you want it to go. It was just in that Trogs game with the scenery, you have to be mindful of that, and and be like, you have to be looking for that, which I wasn't until I'd gotten a few more reps in. So yeah, absolutely, it doesn't require months and months and months of practice to learn a list, but if you can get 3, 4, 5, I mean, obviously the more the better, but like getting those first 3 to 5 games, and I think you're going to see a big uptick in like how well the list and what sort of stuff it does.
would you ever use just for talking into generic tournaments now, I
Hmm.
guess, would you ever look at using those games to tinker? Do you tend to tinker with lists from practice games, or do you tend to generate a list and just go, do you know what, I know that list is strong on paper, so what I'm gonna do is work out how it works, or do you actually tinker post
So,
practice?
I mean, technically, I tinkered this list after messing up my charges and went from Corn to Nurgle. But in general, I'm actually not
Right.
much of a list tinkerer. The reason being that I think Age of Sigmar is a very low sample size game. You're going to go to, most of the time, you're talking about what's going to be good for one event that you play 5 games at. So if you wanted to make a sort of really, especially for singles, teams is a bit different, but for singles, if you're like, I want to make a market improvement to my list, you're looking at saying, what can I change in my list that's going to get me plus 20% win rate versus armies that I don't know what I'm facing. And I always think it's like, it's really hard to know what that could possibly be or whether it exists. I think sometimes people talk about like, oh, well, this is meta, so I'm going to change my list. And it's like, well, one, are you going to face that list? We talked about this a bit before, but are you going to face them? Are you going to face them on an opponent who's equally your skill level? Because if your opponent's way better or way worse than you, it might not matter that it's a bad matchup. So for me, I tend to just say,
Yeah.
look, I picked a list, and I'm just going to practice that list, and that's going to make me stronger than tinkering with the list. So like, for the only other list I've really played in 4th is Mixed Gits, which is a Mixed Gits list I've been playing since 2nd edition, basically the same units in it, changed a few over the years depending on points, but like I really I turned up to an event with that, and I was I went, I think it was actually the last clash, and I went 4-1, and it was just straight off the back of just, it wasn't a super strong list. It wasn't a meta list, but I was like, I played it for so long that I'm comfortable on the battle plans. I'm comfortable in the matchups. I know, like, what does what. And so I think really that counts for a lot.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So in terms of, so you had some decent matchups, got the drop. So if your opponent, I think a lot of people have seen this list. Like you say, there's or a similar list to this. I think went. I think Mr. Tassone took it to the GT a couple of weeks ago. Very, very similar to this. So it obviously works. It's obviously a very strong list to work well in singles as well.
Yep.
If you were looking to take it on, or you're looking at an event and you might face this, how do you think people might look at taking this, bringing it down, or bringing it down to size, or at least competing on the table without just kind of walking off, seeing it flying off?
Well, I mean, the best piece of advice is don't let them roll the 4 up on priority. But aside from that, I think the weakness of the list comes from, sort of what we've touched on, is that it's a low model count or low unit count. You've got these 2 units that do stuff and a bunch of chaff, right? And how well you can exploit that particular part will depend a bit on your list. But if you are able to kill everything except for the Chosen and Archaon, right? And like Archaon doesn't do that much. When Archaon was fighting a block of 6 Trogs, he killed 2 Trogs before he died. I mean, other stuff was killing him, but like he was not doing loads and loads of damage. He's got a low number of attacks, so he can sort of whiff. So if you are clearing off the rest of the things, and making it so that it's very hard to do battle tactics for Archaon, or to be on multiple objectives for the Archaon list, then that's probably going to be the biggest weakness of the list you can exploit. The other thing I'd say is the Chosen are slow, so if you can deny them stop them from getting into the really juicy stuff as best you can. Obviously, sometimes if you're up against that double, that's going to be tough. But if you can deny them getting the really juicy stuff and then really hit them hard, especially if there's a turn where they fail, the Sorcerer Lord gives them a 5-up ward on a 3+. If they fail the 3-up, and then you can use that as an opportunity. Especially if people are playing the Khorne version, they aren't -1 to wound, so they're also reasonably easy to kill. You can exploit that. The other thing is if you are lower drops, or if you're 2 drops and you win the roll-off, you can force the Archaon player to go first. Because the flip side of that ability is if you're going first in the round, you essentially never want to use it, because you do not want to let your opponent know that they're going to get a free double turn. So if you do have that choice of going first or second, I would rather make the Archaon player go first, so that they can't even roll the dice. And then, if they win priority, maybe they have to take it, and again, they can't use the ability again. And so you can play from there. Obviously, it is a really strong list, and a lot of the advice for beating it is going to come down to just the advice of good games in general, which is just pick good fights, score your objectives, pick good battle tactics. But yeah, I think a lot of it is that Archaon doesn't do maybe as much damage as some people think. The Chosen are really like the big threat. So if you can roadblock them, tie them up with chaff, or actually kill them if you're playing an explosive enough list, then that's all good stuff to do.
So within reason, similar to kind of previous Archaon lists, isn't it? If you can't kill him, avoid him if possible. Kind of spread out, and like I say, he can only be in so many places at once, can't he?
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe pounce on the Chosen, but yeah, it's a nice looking list. And like I said, I think slaves have seen quite a bit of them, and I think it's interesting that it's quite there's a bit of a renaissance. I say renaissance, but I mean we've only had the new edition for 12, 14 weeks now, something like that. But it's interesting how everybody dived on Varangard in like the first 4 weeks, kind of because they've got the speed. You can get where they need to be, you can buff them up. But I think Chosen have seen a lot of love recently, haven't they? Between the fact you can drop that 3d6 charge onto them, and get a lot of those attacks out on a smaller platform, right? So
for sure, yeah, they get and it's. I think there's also a thing that while Archaon has a low number of high quality attacks, makes it prone to variance, both up and down. But the Chosen, because there are a lot of attacks, on 3s and 3s or 2s and 3s with all out attack, that you can you can trust that damage a bit more. I would trust that the Chosen will kill anything that they should kill, whereas Archaon, I wouldn't trust them to kill even 1 Trog, 2 Trogs, because because you're like, I would expect him to, of course, but I maybe wouldn't pick it as a battle tactic just because you're like, they've got a ward, like he's got a chance of just missing a bunch of attacks. Also see Phil Marshall, our boy, the England captain, has asked a question in the chat. Might have already covered it, but how useful was holding the Eye of Shirian open as a deterrent for your opponent? Yeah, so that's what I did in my last game. Was just hold it so that basically my opponent kept one priority and then would give me the turn so that I couldn't then set up for a double. And I actually never ended up using the ability because I didn't want to set him up for ability. So yeah, I guess technically I actually won 75% of the times I used the Eye of Shirian. But yeah, so that's also a tactic.
That's a tweak this edition, isn't it? For anyone who's not faced Archaon yet, I think in third, you didn't have to show the result of the dice roll, did you?
There was a time, there was a time when you rolled it like under a cup or something, and so only you would know the answer. They changed that, I think for two reasons. One, people might be like, oh, did he swap the dice under the cup? But I think also, in some ways, you always sort of would know. Like, if I rolled it and I know I'm not going second, I'm not going to all in on the double as a bluff. Because my opponent would be like, oh, he's going to win the double. And then I'd reveal the dice and they'd be like, wait, what's he doing?
He wasted his...
Oh, and also, Big Tom has made a good comment here, which is redeploying the chosen forward in your opponent's turn, which can just get them some free movement. So yeah, that's also a nice thing. It's good, a good Warhammer tip in general for slow units, where sometimes I think people think that redeploy, its most common use is to make a charge longer or something like that, but you can also just use it for your slow units, just being like, well, I know I've got a long way to go, so in your turn I'm just going to move d6 forward. He also mentioned staying within range of the sorcerer, which is good. Also, my chosen really tended to only be in range of the sorcerer for 2 turns, really, because once they've charged, the Sorcerer Lord has trouble keeping up, and often I was using the Sorcerer Lord for maybe seize the center or running him after Archaon to heal Archaon. So again, when you don't have a lot of parts, like a Sorcerer Lord, obviously, in theory, he'd always be able to buff these units, but also sometimes I just had to use him as, fancy chaff, basically. I used him to roadblock six trogs. And obviously he instantly... I think actually they just killed him with the rocks, so we didn't even manage that. But the theory was that he could maybe force them to go around him or something like that. But yeah, so I sort of... In the first couple turns, I'd be using him for buffs and for heals when I could. And then often he was off running to do a battle tactic or something like that.
Which I guess, again, is good steer for those of our viewers who are not facing Archaon and chosen every week. If you can split up these buff lists, there's a lot of these top tier lists are kind of really, really cleverly designed, aren't they? Around, you were saying with the trolls, with Trug's buff and the Dankhold buff, and then the Gobblepalooza buff. You can actually break the army up somehow and try and make it spread itself apart. Kind of start to pull that apart, but that comes down to kind of skill level of play, doesn't it? Kind of, if you, for sure, like you said, if you know what you're doing with your list and kind of keep your castle together and hold your nerve, a bit like a game of chicken, isn't it? Who can keep the castle together the longest?
and also there are bad if you do have a lot of shooting, or even some shooting, I would say shoot off Archaon's bodyguard. That's always a good, because then your melee stuff doesn't get -1 attack. Mark of Nurgle, which you have on Archaon. In my case, I have on the Chosen. Only works in melee. My opponent used Scragrot to zap off a bunch of my Chaos Chosen with his Fangs of the Moon spell. So, range damage is going to help you in a lot of those situations. I think maybe in the Trog game, I don't remember exactly whether my opponent tried to or had the range, but I was worried that he would teleport Scragrot and then Fangs of the Moon off the bodyguard, again, to unlock all his Trogs from being -1 attack. Didn't matter, he just exploded Archaon anyways, but... so if you can, and if there's an angle, sometimes Archaon will make a long charge and the Raptorics can't keep up with them. Also, for people who don't know, if the bodyguard charges, the -1 attack does not apply for that turn. So if you can find if Archaon has to move a bit further away from the Raptors or something like that, and you find a way to pick off the Raptors easily, then that falls roughly into the strategy of killing off the chaff. But yeah, that works.
Things like Lumineth, Skaven,
Zinch,
Caradron, I guess.
Yep,
could make it quite difficult for you. Which again, I guess is that you said right at the start the difference between a teams event and a singles event, right? Which,
yes.
like you say, you don't know what you might face in singles, do you? And
Yeah.
what you might have to come up with. So, although it would have been interesting, I said, I think this list is similar to what Nick Tazzone took at the GT and kind of definitely faced Mike at some point with his Lumineth.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that matchup went, but I
just roll the 4 up on the I have Shirian, because also if the weakness of the list is shooting, then one of the things a little bit less with covering fire, but that's only the closest unit, so you can play around it. But melee happens in both players' turns, so if you've got a big melee unit fighting Archaon, you're like, okay, well, he's going to hit me first, but I'm going to hit him, assuming they're tanky like Chosen or Trogs. But if you're playing shooting and Archaon's guaranteed the double, you're going to skip one of your shooting phases. So I think it's, as we sort of said about get out of jail free cards, you might be like, oh, this shooting list is really tough, but if Archaon goes into your front line, kills them, or powers through into your back line, and now is into all that juicy shooting, it can be very problematic for the shooting list. So although shooting is good, I would guess, although they didn't play against it, I would guess that Tzeentch might also be good. They have so much control. They have shooting. They have the Skyfires who have like priority damage. So I can see Tzeentch would probably be good against this list. Not 100% sure, having not played it. But yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, if you get a double, power through, go into the Lord of Change in Kairos with Archaon, maybe it's problematic, but even if he wins the double, they can heroic intervention, teleport something. So, I mean, Tzeentch can always do something. So, yeah, that might
become unstoppable force versus a movable object.
Exactly. So
once around. Excellent. So it was a good event. You enjoyed yourself.
Yeah. The Scottish scene is always love. I mean, I drive 6 hours up there and 6 hours back for the weekend, but it's always worth it. It's always loads of nice people. It's good to see people. Good to talk about Warhammer. I had a couple of people who were like, "Oh, you're JP, the guy who does all the painting," and I was like, there was a time when people knew me because I was good at the game, and that time has unfortunately passed. But yeah, it was really nice to see everyone.
Fantastic. Well, that's great news. So that's another event down, another 5-0, make it look easy. Back to the painting desk now.
Yeah, exactly.
The first love. Super. Well, anything else you want to say about the list or the event? Or
No. I mean, I encourage anyone to play Slaves to Darkness. I've played Slaves for, as I said, on and off with other lists in second edition. They tend to always have some build that's competitive. It may not be Archaon. They've also got Be'lakor, who's always like a cool unit to include. They've got Varangard. They've got Marauders. They've got the Dark Oath and stuff like that. So play some Slaves. They're often fun and good.
Choices,
exactly. So
they're a bit like the anti-Stormcast, aren't they? They're a nice way in if you don't want to be the Golden Boys, aren't they?
Yeah.
Like good armor, good combat attacks, decent magic, like you say, a lot of choice. You're going to feel some big monsters.
And you don't have to play Order, which those are the worst types of players.
I wouldn't know. I play Death.
Yeah.
Who's an Order player?
I never heard. I apparently Death players also have a reputation. In my mind, maybe it's because I was a Death player for a reasonably long time. But some people are like, yeah. Or we were sort of discussing. We were like, Destruction players are obviously the best, even though Trogs are like really, really, really strong right now. Somehow they have no rep as filth, and then it's like Chaos is like second best because I guess they're like edgy and cool. And then people are like, yeah, Death players are bad and Order players are the worst. And I was like, what do Death players do? They're just chilling.
I think we play charity Death, don't we? We both play Flesh Eaters. So
yeah.
I think people don't like facing 200 zombies.
Yeah. Okay. No, yeah. That might be it.
Maybe we should separate Death players from Soulblight players. Maybe Nighthawk need a category there as well. But Feck are definitely a charity list.
Yeah. Well, Feck, I guess also in the lore they're sort of the closest to alive as well. So that's that's narrative.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking us through the list. It's been a learning curve. Hopefully, we've had something there for newer players and tournament players as well to get their heads around. We are back again, hopefully in a couple of days' time. Aren't we? We're going to try and give you all a bit of a preview of what we've got coming up in the next month or so. We've been plotting, haven't we? In terms of what you guys might listen to us musing on. We might talk crap, but hopefully it'll be interesting crap. So we'll look to give you a preview of the next month in a couple of days or so. In the meantime, if you've liked listening to us, please like and subscribe. We're going to try and start this content going and keep the momentum behind it, and give you guys something interesting to watch every week going forward. So, yeah, thanks for listening to this point. Cheers for coming, JP.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thanks.
And thanks for listening, guys. We'll catch you next time. Take care.